Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We are going to give everyone a minute or two to join the webinar, and we'll get started here shortly. All right, thanks to those who have joined us here. We will be starting in about 1 minute. All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our latest webinar, Outcompete TPAs and OTCs with a Winning Patient Journey. I'm Chelsea Treseder, and I have the pleasure of being joined by Will Dials and Adam Jasa of the Pivot Hearing team. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. We will leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to ask them by clicking the Q&A button in your Zoom interface. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, please feel free to send us a chat and we'll help you out. Today's presentation is all about how private practices can compete against market disruptions like TPAs and OTCs. The most important thing a practice can do is differentiate. TPAs and OTCs, and big box stores for that matter, have a clear value proposition to patients. Low cost, at least initially. We as private practice owners are not well suited to compete in that domain for obvious reasons. Where we do have a clear competitive edge is in the ability to provide patients a far superior overall experience, which will lead to more patients, happier patients, better outcomes, and financial success for your practice. We're going to outline a strategy for how to effectively provide patients with a better choice and how to effectively communicate that value proposition to prospective and existing patients alike. And very little of this strategy has anything to do with price. As my friend Brad Stewart says, being the second cheapest isn't a competitive advantage. You must lean into your differentiated relative strengths in order to be successful against low-cost players of any variety. It's easy to get discouraged with everything going on in the industry today, but we believe there's plenty of room for optimism. We believe that there is and always will be a large segment of patients who are interested in high-end care from an independent hearing practice that can provide an experience that will outcompete a cheap hearing aid from your insurance company or a self-fit OTC device every single time. So today we're going to discuss the current market dynamics that independent private practices are facing, how delivering the right patient journey is a competitive advantage for practices, how the hearing aid test drive is a critical component of the hardest and most difficult parts of the journey, the patient and business benefits of the hearing aid test drive, and how you can implement this patient journey in your practice. With that, I'll turn it over to Will to talk about the current state of the market and the challenges that we're all facing.
All right, thanks, Chelsea. Okay, yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the current market forces that we are dealing with across the industry and specifically in the private practice space, which is what we're here to talk about today. And there are really three main things that we're paying attention to right now. Obviously, the finalization of the OTC legislation and the arrival of some of the kind of early entrants into this space with the self-fit devices. That's something over the past few months that's made a lot of noise in the news. And it's definitely something that we're all talking about a fair amount with patients in our practices. But I think we agree with what the Sonova CEO Arne Kaldowski said on an earnings call recently, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said that OTCs can be disruptive initially as providers are having to explain the differences between between professionally fit devices and these over-the-counter self-fitting devices, but that in the end, there probably isn't much overlap between the people that are buying OTC devices and existing hearing aid patients. So while we don't view this as a large threat to the private practice space long-term, it is definitely something that we need to be aware of and make sure that our current value propositions are clearly differentiated from this new category of devices and style of hearing loss treatment. And big box hearing aid retail is nothing new. We've been competing against this segment of the market for many years now, but it continues to grow at an impressive clip with some estimates of at more than 20% year over year. The technology that's sold through this channel is close, if not on par with the technology that we work with in our practices. But there are real limitations with this business model in terms of the care and service that they're able to provide. So, and that's where our advantage lies in the private practice space, where we can have a real differentiated value proposition for patients. But I think by far the most meaningful disruption that we've seen in recent years in our industry has been the growth in the managed care space or third-party administrators, which is generally driven by the growth in Medicare Advantage penetration, which is where we see these plans and these benefits coming into play. So hearing aids that are dispensed through this channel represent a fundamental change in just about every aspect of the business, from clinical and financial and otherwise, and not really for the better. So there are obvious differences between this segment of the market and ours, the private practice side, in terms of the professional care and service that we can provide and what they might get through their third-party benefit. But it's something we need to be really aware of when we're thinking about our practices and why a patient might choose us, as opposed to just calling that 1-800 number on the back of their Medicare Advantage cards and go that route when it comes to treating their hearing loss. All right, next slide, Adam. Thank you. Perfect. So at Pivot Hearing, we've developed a KPI and business intelligence tool that's called My Vitals Pro, or MVP for short. And it integrates with the major OMSs in our industry. So Cycle, Counsel, Blueprint, and TIMS. And the tool gets nightly updates with sales, appointments, and other data so that practice owners and managers can easily understand what's going on in their business with real-time data. And because we have all this data from so many private practices, we can aggregate it and use it to understand macro industry trends like the growth of third-party, for example. So right now, I'm going to show you what kind of impact that the growth in third-party has had to the private practice space. And what you're seeing here in the yellow line is the percentage of hearing aid units that went through a third party going back to 2015. And you can see that line has gone up and up each year over the last several years. And the blue line is the gross margin generated on average per unit. So what we can see here is that as the third party percentage of the overall market has increased, that has dragged down our gross margins per unit. And another way to look at this data, over the past 2 years, we can see that the third-party units have made up approximately 25% of the total units, at least in this data set of private practices, while that 25% is only responsible for 11% of the total gross margin. So based on these figures, we can see the differences in the gross margin per fitting or per patient, third-party versus private pay. And what the data shows is that it takes approximately 2.6 third-party patients needed to generate the gross margin of one private pay patient rather. So it's essentially 3 times the work for the same amount of profit. And the key point here that I want to make is just that it's critical to do whatever we can to grow the private pay side of the business, as the return on investment is just significantly higher when we focus on that. Next slide, Adam. While it seems like we are seeing huge changes to our industry that can be, quite scary, and there are also some things that just continue to remain true. So treating hearing loss is complex and difficult. If it weren't the case, then what would we be doing all day in our practices? If you take a look at the schedules of any successful practice, a large percentage of overall clinic time is spent servicing, adjusting, and solving problems for current hearing aid patients. And this is care and service that our patients need. And the other channels that we're talking about today, third party and OTC, are going to succeed or fail based on their ability to provide it. And finally, our strengths as independent hearing care practices have never been more differentiated than they are right now. As we'll get into throughout this presentation, you compare the experience of a patient that they're going to have in a private practice setting, or that they can have in a private practice setting, to a typical third party fitting where Their choices are going to be limited and the service is minimal, if anything at all. And an even more striking comparison would be to the OTC model, where a patient is essentially on their own when something goes wrong, which we all know inevitably will happen at some point. So the value we bring to the patients is clear, and we need to recognize that and lean into these strengths in order to effectively compete against these market threats. Next slide. Perfect. And it can sometimes feel overwhelming, all these changes, no question about it. And third party and big box have grown rapidly and taken a nice chunk of the market overall. But the slide here we're looking at shows for 2022 who is acquiring or purchasing the hearing aids that are being fit across the industry. And what we can see here, I think it's good news that in spite of all of this change, the independent channel is still the largest overall segment of the hearing aid market at 31%. So access to low-cost hearing aids at big box stores and through managed care plans is not exactly a new phenomenon, but the fact remains that approximately 1 in 3 hearing aids is still dispensed through an independent hearing care clinic. And we view that as a validation that the high-end private practice business model is sound and that it's actually something that patients are still looking for. So, all right. I'll turn it over to Adam now to get into a little bit more.
Okay, so a winning patient journey, it really needs to be planned out if you want to outcompete third parties, over-the-counter, big box stores, other private practices, really any competitive threat. So this diagram here, it's the patient journey, and I'm just going to kind of walk through it. So it consists of new patient marketing and initial appointment, follow-up, and purchase, which is what we call the hearing aid test drive. Then continued care and service. So this consists of your clean and checks, hearing tests, continued support for the patient. And then after that, you're doing existing patient marketing, which is like patient special events, newsletters, things of that type. And then upgrade appointments, follow-up, purchase, which is the hearing aid test drive again. Then after that, continued patient care and service, and the process kind of continues on. So the journey is ongoing with the goal of taking care of someone for life and upgrading them periodically into new hearing aids so that they're always hearing their absolute best. So what is the hearing aid test drive specifically? It's the beginning and most important part of the patient journey. So for many new patients, this is like the first face-to-face experience they're going to have with you in your practice. So the test drive process, it's not only designed to help them find like the perfect hearing aid for them, but to really give them an idea of what to expect from your practice for years to come. It's very important. It's the start of a relationship. This process was really born from our practice, Kenwood Hearing Centers, which is a 7-location practice in Northern California, staffed by audiologists and dispensers. Will and Chelsea's dad, Bill Dials, has been an audiologist for most of his life, and he's been fitting hearing aids in this way for most of his career at our practice. So we really knew firsthand the benefits of doing this. It kind of initially started as a way to formalize the process, to make it really easy for all our providers to utilize. And eventually we started training other Pivot members on how to implement this in their practice. And it also started generally just as a patient process, but it kind of grew to influence every part of the practice, including operations and marketing. And although we've been doing this for many years, I just want to say that the process seems to get more important and relevant every single day, since it's such a clear differentiator from third parties, big box, and the over-the-counter options. So what makes the hearing aid test drive different from a standard trial? We feel the need to explain this because occasionally we talk to practices who think that they already do this because they give people like an in-office or maybe a 1-week trial. And I hope by the end of this talk, you'll understand really how much more this process is than just your typical standard trial. So it seeks the best, not just good. This establishes a process to choose the best hearing aid for the patient's hearing loss, not just a good one, because you're trialing multiple manufacturers and technologies. There's zero financial obligation to start. So there's no obligation until the patient agrees that the hearing improvement is a good value. This traditionally has been a little bit controversial for some providers we talk to, the fact that we don't require money or commitment right up front. And although it's not a requirement for the test drive, the positives of making this easy for people to start with amplification really far outweigh any potential negatives that we've come across. And we'll touch on all these benefits throughout this presentation. It's practice-based, manufacturer neutral. So we'll use language like this to the patient. We're an independent family-owned practice. We have all the options. We're not owned or controlled by any hearing aid manufacturers. So we have the autonomy to find the best hearing aid for you. This makes our practice unique in the area. We don't put any time limits on this. This, I think, is a differentiator from a lot of the standard trials that people run. So the process typically will take weeks, not hours or days to complete. And this, I think, helps the patient to feel comfortable with plenty of time to make a reasonable decision without feeling any pressure. And it's patient-centered, not transactional. The transaction happens at the very end of the test drive. So this makes the process patient and hearing-centered. And really, if you think about it, it's the complete opposite of third-party programs in OTC. So I'm going to go into like the patient care benefits of the test drive. There's really no pressure at all. It's hard for somebody to say no to a totally risk-free test drive. So it puts a lot less pressure on the patient. You know, patients typically are worried about getting sold. I think it's one of the reasons why people wait so long to come into the practice. So, you know, you're definitely not trying to sell them. It puts less pressure on the provider also in that first appointment. So I think having no pressure really makes it the entire interaction like very easy to get everybody involved. It has the patient's best interests at heart. So it's very easy for the patient to get started with amplification. All they're really agreeing to is to give hearing aids a try. So it's typically far easier than patients ever anticipate it to be. We make it easy for the practice to get involved too, because we're utilizing demo hearing aids for this. And Pivot Hearing can help you obtain those. It empowers or it establishes trust by building the relationship before the financial transaction. This is extremely important. There's no deposit, no commitment for the patient to start. So that's very unique. I can't tell you how many times in an appointment we're kind of getting towards the end and the patient will say things like, well, what do I need to leave for a deposit, or what do I need to sign? And we're very easy about it. We say nothing, just give them a try. And when we do that, they're usually very surprised, very impressed. So what we're doing is we're putting our trust in the patient first, even though we just met them. And I think that in turn really helps them to trust us. So it's going to empower the patient and inspire confidence in their decision. So patients are part of this decision-making process. The only strong recommendation we make is really the benefit of amplification in general. So because people are involved and they're trying out the hearing aids, you're going to process practically zero returns, because people are only going to buy when they've been wearing the hearing aids. They know exactly what they're getting into. And I think this leads to better hearing aid outcomes and increased patient satisfaction. So this was a recent survey of 602 consumers conducted by Amplifone. And I'm just going to kind of highlight the main findings. Number one, they found that consumers want choices. So consumers know that there's a ton of options out there, and likely they're not going to feel confident in buying the first thing they try. Certainly not the first thing they just pull off the shelf at a store. So they want to have those choices. But they also, number two, they're going to rely heavily on the advice of the provider. So sometimes people think that this hearing aid test drive kind of removes the expertise of the provider, since we're not making a really strong recommendation. And I mean, in our process, we're still narrowing down the choices. We're still providing expertise that the customer obviously wants. We're offering recommendations. We're just not doing it in a way that backs you into a corner, or in a way that makes the patient feel like they're not totally part of the process. And then number three essentially says that consumers want to know what their choices are before purchasing. So the test drive is all about patient choice. And it's important to make that very clear on your messaging, like, on your website or in your advertising. So essentially, the things the survey shows as being very important to consumers, namely product choice and provider expertise, these things are either severely limited or just really non-existent with third-party plans and over-the-counter. So in addition to training and supporting providers and how to run this, we've also created all the marketing materials you need to use this as a tool to get new patients in the door. So if you already happen to do a process like the test drive, that's great, but we never generally come across practices that are marketing the process in an effective way. So in other words, they have a great experience for the patient, but people don't know that until they actually get into the office and experience it. So we're using the test drive itself as a tool to attract patients. So to the right, you'll see that this ad, it's a sample. It's one of our older ones we've had really good success with. And I wanted to read like the specific words we have that we put in a lot of our messaging. So number one, make an appointment for an initial hearing evaluation. Number two, take home a state-of-the-art hearing aid with no deposit commitment or deposit required. Number three, take your time evaluating which hearing aid suits you best. So when we first came up with this, we were kind of nervous to put this like these bold statements right out there in the public. And we had the same worries that many practices we talked to still have. Like, well, if I do this, won't patients just take off with the hearing aids, or are people ever going to feel the need to commit to anything and purchase? Or don't I have to make that strong recommendation, being the expert? And I can tell you from running this messaging for many years at this point, hundreds of practices all over the place, any of these like fears, they're really practices have found them to be unfounded, and especially the idea of people taking off with hearing aids and stuff like that. The issues have been so rare. With our practice, I can't even really think of like one time that we found out that somebody like purposely ripped us off. So kind of a non-issue. When you have this kind of messaging out there, people typically call and they're just ready to schedule appointments. It's clearly explained what people can expect when they come to the practice. So you're going to get people calling and just saying they want to schedule the test drive, or they'll just go on our website and schedule online. So before we did this kind of messaging, which was practice and process focused, we would do more product typed advertising, and a lot of times people on the phone would ask a lot of questions about price. So when you kind of advertise in this way, it does make the job of actually scheduling the appointment a lot easier. And once you start seeing these patients, you'll find that they really generate excellent patient reviews. And this is just one of my favorites. I'll read it for you guys. Every person I met during my experience at Kenwood Hearing Center was extremely pleasant, patient, and professional. I tried out several hearing aids before deciding on one, and the result has been a positive, life-changing experience. I highly recommend this company. So we have tons of reviews like this that they're not only 5 stars, but where the patient actually discusses the process of trying out different hearing aids and how much they appreciated that. So some of our reviews, people even talk about how they went to other places. They didn't get that kind of experience, and how it was really a breath of fresh air when they discovered our practice and learned about how we do things. So I want you to think about these types of reviews and compare them to the kind of reviews you might expect to get from third-party patients. Not to say that they're all going to be bad, but usually people are a little bit more concerned about those patients. We talk to a lot of practice owners who are a little bit afraid of getting bad reviews from patients who might have had a bad experience with the third party, but not necessarily the practice. Because the thing is, many patients are going to have trouble distinguishing between the practice and the third party. And if they have an issue or they're going to write a bad review, they're likely going to level that complaint or negative review towards the practice, since that's who they're working with face to face. So, I mean, this is unfortunate. It can have unfair repercussions on your practice's reputation. So once adopted, the hearing aid test drive becomes one of the most critical elements in your practice value proposition and patient journey. the most important differentiator from all your competitors, the central communication in your marketing, and it really becomes a moat around your business that no competitive threats can cross, especially TPAs and OTCs. So as you can see, we put this message everywhere. This is just like on the website. We put it in Google search ads, a lot of different print ad ideas that we've come up with, Facebook ads. It's always a highlight in our database letters. We put it in our seminar advertising. In summary, it becomes the centerpiece in everything you do, including your image, advertising, sales process, how you run your operations, and how you generate quality referrals. So I'm going to get into the step-by-step of how this all works and how we've trained many practices how to run the process. And I'm going to go through this from the perspective of working with a new hearing aid user, but the process would be very similar for really any patient or any situation that comes your way. So as you can see here, there's a number of steps to the process. And to some people, initially, it seems like a lot of work, but it's totally worth it. If you spend more time with patients up front before they make that final decision, I think there's time saved later on because generally the patients are happier and they're less likely to have future issues because they have that additional confidence in the decision they made. So before you even do the face-to-face first appointment, before the appointment, there's key points to keep in mind. You want to have everybody in your team completely on board with the process and prepared to deliver this exceptional patient journey and prepared to be able to explain that. So this is essential for success. In some ways, how things are handled before the initial appointment, it's just as important as the appointment itself. Because the fact is, if this isn't handled correctly, then the patient's never making it into the office. So we've created training and materials for this. We've created a phone script to assist staff. It's also important for everyone who represents the practice in the community to be able to explain the test drive and patient journey as a key differentiator. So examples would include anyone who does physician referral marketing or any kind of networking outside of the office. So I'm going to go through how we train people and how we do our initial appointments. And we typically schedule 90 minutes for these. It consists of the intake and greeting, the hearing evaluation, and then fitting hearing aids, the test drive. So I think for this whole first appointment, the main goal for a provider to focus on is not to be making a sale. That's thinking way too far ahead, but simply to just get that patient started wearing hearing aids. That makes it very simple. So everything you do should be geared towards completing that goal. And then you really are not worrying about, much else. In that patient greeting, very simple, start off with questions to get them talking about their hearing, and then go over the intake and hearing health history with them. And then proceed right to that hearing test. So another thing we recommend is that the time spent from that initial greeting to the hearing test should be rather short as comfortably possible. So you really don't want to get bogged down before the hearing test with tons of questions about hearing aids pricing. You don't want to get too deep into conversation. I think it's best to handle all of that stuff when the patient's actually wearing hearing aids. So then you have kind of a dual advantage there. You can spend time, answer all their questions, make sure they're comfortable, but they're also experiencing the amplification at the same time. So you can fine tune the hearing aids. This keeps that goal of fitting the hearing aids in the first appointment completely on track. And then you'll do the hearing test. You'll review everything with them. If the hearing loss warrants it, you make a recommendation for amplification in general, but not necessarily a specific hearing aid. And then you'll want to go ahead and explain the test drive process to the patient. Something like this. As far as trying hearing aids, we really make this as easy as possible for you. If you're up for it, I can fit you with trial devices today, and then you can take them home, try them out in your own environment so you can really experience what the benefits are. Typically, we have you come back in a week or so, then you can tell me how it's going and we'll take it from there. Does that sound good? People are typically going to say, yeah, that sounds fine. And then you proceed to fit the hearing aids. So as you go through this initial appointment, obviously a lot of questions are going to come up. I just put a few of the most common ones up here to show you how easily they are answered by the test drive. So like, do I really need hearing aids yet? Well, according to your hearing test, yes, you'd benefit from hearing aids. But the only way you'll really know is by trying them. How do I know which hearing aid is right for me? The answer is very simple. The only way to really know is to experience the benefits in your day-to-day life. So what if I try these hearing aids and don't want to buy them? Hey, if for whatever reason it doesn't work out, just bring them back and then we can start again when you are ready. So because this whole process is so consultative, very patient-centered, if you go through it and at any point somebody decides not to move forward, you can at least know that you did everything you could to help by removing all the typical barriers. So you're making it very easy for people to get started. And if you do this, you're simply going to fit more hearing aids. So how to handle pricing. This is a really big one for providers. These are our recommendations. Focus on the hearing first. So especially in this first appointment, you don't necessarily want to get into pricing right out of the gates. You want to first build trust through this whole test drive process. And the fact is, in many cases at that first appointment, you really don't have all the information you need to quote an out-of-pocket price to the patient at that point. You need to get important questions answered first. Like, well, what does the patient need? You don't even really know that yet. Which hearing aid will suit them best? You don't know that. What is their budget? And then, do they have any insurance benefits available? A lot of times you don't have this important information. So we feel that it's best to get answers to these questions through the hearing aid test drive process instead of just upfront quoting a price, because that might be inaccurate or it might scare the patient away. If you can hold off and discuss pricing at follow-up appointments, then you'll have the opportunity to build more trust by letting the patient wear the hearing aids, experience the benefits for a week or more with no deposit or commitment. And then when they come back, you're in a much better position to have those price discussions. Now, this doesn't mean that we're afraid to quote prices at all. If you're asked, definitely discuss it. If you can quote a range, I think that's ideal. So you can say something like this as an example. We're an independent practice. We have all the options. The prices range from X to X per pair. I'm recommending you just start with these demos for the first week. Once you've had a chance to try them in your environments, we'll have a much better idea what direction to go in. And then at your follow-up appointment, we'll also have checked your insurance so we can get into all of those details. People are usually very okay with something like that. In this first appointment, especially a new patient, most of them really don't understand what they were getting for the price. They don't understand like whether it's like the hearing aid technology or the services included. And at this point, they really don't understand what they need. So instead of like explaining it to them, you want to show it to them by having them experience the test drive over a few weeks. This will help put it all in perspective for them so they really understand like what they're paying for. And you'll find that many people will end up spending more than they anticipated initially if you can show them what they're getting for the money. And then another recommendation is to start off with premium technology for that first demo fit. You want to do this unless you have a really good reason not to. This is a good idea because you really want to do everything you can to ensure that you're going to give them a very positive first experience. Doing this is going to lead to selling more premium units, and that's going to equal more satisfied patients and higher ASP. And then you can always work your way down if you have to, and they can try lower technology levels if price is really a concern. But in my opinion, that's the only reason why you would want to go down. It is important to have a range of options for different patients and situations, especially when you're competing against those third-party programs and big box stores like Costco. So as you continue through the process, other questions, of course, are going to come up. You're going to have to make key points. You're going to have to educate. So to assist in all of this, many of our members like to use a custom slideshow that we've developed to help educate patients on subjects. Subjects like, ear anatomy, hearing loss, how you hear with your brain, cognitive decline, making comparisons to vision loss, products, and of course, going through the hearing aid test drive. Okay, so we're kind of getting to the end of that first appointment, and you really want to set up expectations for the follow-up appointment. This is really key. The follow-up appointment needs to be thought of as part of the entire fitting process. This helps ensure that the patient's going to come back to the office with the expectation of continuing the hearing aid test drive and not bringing those hearing aids back in a bag if something went wrong. And I know that's happened to everybody on this call. So a couple of examples of ways to explain this to the patient before they leave. You can say something like, now don't worry if it's not perfect. We're just at the very beginning of this. We don't know how to specifically adjust the hearing aids until you've worn them in your environments and you're able to give us feedback on how that went. We're using your hearing tests and the tools we have to kind of get in the ballpark, but until you wear them, we don't know exactly how to fine tune those. At your follow-up appointment, we're going to ask you how it's been going. We're going to go over data logging. We're going to fine tune those hearing aids, or maybe we'll try a totally different option. The follow-up appointment is really exciting because that's when we get to really know about you and your unique hearing so we can adjust them specifically to you. Another thing you can say is you're not making any decisions at this point. You can even take this a step further by preparing the patient to try multiple options. So in many cases, we'll explain to the patient right up front to expect to try 2 or more hearing aids over the course of a few weeks so they can get a comparison. The benefits of doing this are you're taking that extra step to find the best hearing aid for the patient. People like and expect to have choices. So that was verified in that Amplifone survey. And really, you're doing everything you can to keep them in that trial process, even if there's some kind of issue in that first week. So you don't have to have patients try multiple options, but if you do, if you take this extra step, it's really going to differentiate you from any competitor. We have situations in our office where people come back after the first week, they have a fantastic experience. They're very excited, they're hearing great, and they're just ready to buy. And we'll actually tell them like, hey, this is awesome. I'm glad they're working so well for you, but I want you to try one more option before you commit, since this is such an important decision. I mean, if you do that, patients are going to be amazed by the fact that they were ready to pay and you told them to hold off and spend a little bit more time just to make sure this is the best option for them. So, I mean, this is what we mean when we say we're delivering the absolute best patient care and experience, and not just like a good or adequate one. So you're at the end of this first appointment, and then you'll schedule a follow-up appointment for them to come back, usually within like 3 to 7 days. And then what you do at the follow-up appointment, these are rather simple. Obviously you're going to ask the patient how everything's been going, and then you're going to decide what to do. Either you're going to fine tune those hearing aids or try another option. And then you continue this process until they found the best hearing aid for them, at a price they can afford. So the entire process usually takes 2 to 4 weeks. Once they're completely satisfied, the final paperwork is completed, which shows them everything they can expect from us for a lifetime of hearing care. Explaining to the patient everything that they're going to get from the practice is really important, and not only make sure that they are always hearing their best, but you want to present the clear difference between the exceptional patient care that they'll receive from you versus other options. Certainly versus like third parties and big box. To the right, you'll see this is our hearing aid success program. This is a document we hand to patients at the end of the test drive, and it just explains everything that they're going to get from us. It's basically unlimited care and service for the life of the hearing aids. And the document goes over everything that includes. Some practices like to really itemize that out and just put a ton of line items in there to really show the patient everything they're going to get. So that's another great way to do it. So as I said earlier, like this is a high level explanation of one part of this patient journey. We have a very detailed training program for Pivot members. It consists of live training on Zoom and documents which show like the patient flow, step-by-step instructions, and like real language examples that top providers in the Pivot network use with patients every single day. The training program is going to give you a structure to the patient journey, and it provides instructions on what to do, what to show, what to say. And it's a great foundation to create your own patient journey that's going to outcompete all competitive threats. So now I'm going to hand it back over to Will.
Great, thanks, Adam. Perfect. So yeah, now we're going to talk about some of the common objections that we hear when we're discussing this concept with practice owners. So the first one, by implementing the hearing aid test drive, I'm delaying cash collection. It's a common complaint or objection. And to some degree, this is true. There's no question about it that you are delaying that initial payment. But we believe that when you implement this method, you will make more private pay sales over time, which will overwhelm any cash delays that you experience at the outset. And if there is any delay with the collection, it's only temporary, because if you really embrace this concept, you're going to have many people at any given time in trials, which means that once you're at that position, the sales will eventually become more even and predictable. Another common thing we hear, as Adam mentioned, was I'm scared I'll get ripped off by patients who have my hearing aids, and this just really doesn't happen. I think I've seen it once in my 12 years in the industry, which is like a number you could certainly live with. And any potential risk that you are taking there with the patient is offset by the goodwill that you are creating by trusting that patient. And we found that if something does happen, manufacturers will have your back if you're really embracing this concept, so they can make you whole if somebody does happen to, or at least help in that area. And then another one that was mentioned earlier that we hear a lot is the idea that patients won't have any skin in the game if they're not making a financial commitment up front. And we just don't buy this argument, and reasonable minds can disagree on this. But, if you think about it, most patients will wait 7 years before doing anything about their hearing loss. So making an appointment, coming into the office and agreeing to try hearing aids is a pretty big step. So we actually believe that is skin in the game, whether you require a deposit or not. And then another one is, I might not have the inventory to support this kind of model. And this would be very, very tough to do without a nice supply of manufacturer demos. So you're going to need quite a few of them if you move forward and embrace this concept. And we can help out with this. Manufacturers understand that the hearing aid test drive is a core part of what we do at Pivot, and are going to be receptive to helping get the demos that you need. So if that's an issue, just reach out and we can help with that. And then, another thing we hear is that this can sound or feel like it's a lot of time and work spent with patients as opposed to a more traditional, hearing aid sales process. And that is possible. Although any time additional time that's spent with patients during this process is time well spent. And Adam, can you go to the next slide, please? Awesome. Great. And to illustrate this point about time spent, we're going to go back to the MVP here data for a second. And what you see here is each blue dot represents an individual clinic. And on the x-axis, you have the TPA percentage of units. So basically, what percentage of the overall units of the practice are third party versus private pay. So as you move to the right, it's a higher and higher percentage of third party on the x-axis. On the y-axis, you have revenue per hour. So what's clear is the practices that do more private pay business as a percentage of their total units, they have significantly higher revenue per hour than those that are more reliant on third party. So the point here is that if you are spending more time with these patients, it's well worth it due to the higher revenue per hour that you're going to generate working with these types of patients versus third party patients. Next slide. All right, so let's go over a few of the business benefits to the hearing aid test drive concept. So prospect retention is one of them. So when someone goes through a hearing aid test drive and for whatever reason, they don't end up purchasing, we've found that they are likely to come back when they are ready. And this is because they had a positive experience in the clinic and they have knowledge now that they can come back at any point in time and they won't be pressured into purchasing anything until they're truly ready and satisfied. It provides a unique marketing message, as we've discussed here today. It's a very unique message that resonates with today's consumers. And when you put this kind of marketing strategy out there, it's likely a very different message from what your competition is doing. We've seen increased ASPs for practices that have implemented this. So when you instill trust in patients and give them time to make their decision, they tend to buy the hearing aid that they need. They get a chance to hear what premium technology has to offer. And oftentimes they'll make that choice once they've had time to experience the real benefits. So cash flow improvements. So when you're using manufacturer demos, that's helpful for working capital because you don't have an invoice for any of the products that are, with 30 or 60 days or whatever it might be. So when you're implementing this strategy, you're only ordering saleable inventory with an invoice once a patient has completed a successful test drive, which means that the likelihood of returns is really low. So the cash flow is a lot more even and steady. And finally, reviews and patient referrals is something that you can really expect when you go forward with this strategy. So as we've seen, patients prefer this method and will talk about it to their friends and online and reviews about this approach. So you're likely to get some really nice reviews if you go forward with this from patients, which can help to augment your overall marketing strategy when people are doing their research online. All right. Next slide. Thanks, Adam. Okay, so anytime that you make the strategic decisions in your practice, it's important to understand the data and the impacts of how things are changing over time. So My Vitals Pro, which we've talked about a few times here today, is a powerful and yet very simple way to accomplish this. So the earlier examples that we've discussed today, we're looking at the data in aggregate for many practices, but what you're seeing on the screen here is an example of the kind of data that you'd be able to see at an individual practice level. So if you're using this tool, you'll be able to monitor the results in real time of implementing a strategy like the hearing aid test drive or any other business strategy for that matter. And you can see the corresponding business impacts in terms of new patient growth, revenue, ASP, and more in real time. All right. So now I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Adam. As you've all seen today, the hearing aid test drive widens your sales funnel at every point. Compelling messaging that speaks to the new consumer drives more new patients to contact your practice. And they're the right kind of patients, not those who are looking for the cheapest possible option, but a really successful overall experience. The type of patient who responds to this kind of marketing is highly qualified and invested in the process and your practice. A compelling, differentiated value proposition that is lived and breathed by every member of your team allows more patients who respond to your marketing to follow through with making and showing up for their appointments. Putting hearing aids on patients during their first appointment means you have more trials walking all the time. We've removed all the barriers. And the process itself, where patients get to try different devices, feel empowered through shared decision-making, and all the while are building relationship and rapport with your practice, ultimately leads to more sales. And these patients will rebuy from you because they now know how much they need you and appreciate that the hearing aid test drive will achieve the best results. Go to the next slide. Before we move to the Q&A, I wanted to just wrap up here quickly. What we learned today is that new market forces are making it harder to compete in some ways, but independent practices do have a clear competitive advantage, the ultimate patient journey and experience. When you lean into that advantage, make it a clear part of your value proposition, and message that properly to new and existing patients, you create a moat around your business that OTCs and TPAs simply can't cross. Our mission here at Pivot Hearing is that we stand with independent private practices because we believe you provide the best care for patients. It is our vision to successfully fortify your practice to thrive against any and all competitive threats, TPAs, OTCs, and anything else that may come our way. Practice value proposition, patient journey, staff training, marketing planning and execution, KPI tools and analysis, strategic decision-making. We touched on all these topics today at least a little bit, and they're just a few of the ways we support the practices that we work with. If you're interested in learning more or having a one-on-one conversation, you can visit us at pivothearing.com, and there are a bunch of different ways to do that. Okay, with that, I'm going to move to some questions. one question here, and it's funny, this is actually something we were talking about as a team earlier this week, is do you feel that OTC will impact big box more than private practice? Will, do you want to take that? I know you and I, we had that exact conversation earlier this week.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly plausible outcome, actually. And it remains to be seen kind of what the impacts are to OTC, or with these devices, and kind of what that means for us. But yeah, it's another low cost option for patients, and so you'd think that that's going to take a bite out of the existing established low cost options that are out there. So I do see OTC as a potential threat to the big box market, but we'll have to see about that.
Okay, great. Here's a question. Maybe you can take this one, Adam. Do you have a formal agreement that you use for the hearing aid test drive, like in case the patient loses or damages the hearing aids?
We actually don't. So we kind of remove all the barriers, make it super easy. We do have practices that have created documents that, in some way say that maybe the patient's responsible for something, or it would have to cover some kind of replacement cost. We've thought about those ideas, but our question has always been like, well, if something happens, like what would we actually do? We're typically using demo hearing aids, and as Will said, it happens so infrequently that if somebody loses one, we just kind of take that risk. And people ask you at the beginning of the test drive, well, what happens if I lose one? And we'll tell them, like, obviously you want to be careful and everything, but if that happens, I don't want you to stress out. So we're kind of, taking the risk on that. Don't worry about it.
Okay, great. Here's another question. Do you ever offer the hearing aid test drive TPA patients? Would this be something you could do and potentially charge for?
We typically would not advise that, just because with your TPA patients, obviously you're working with fitting fees and smaller margins. So you want to have a pretty airtight system for that, where it's not potentially getting in the way of your private pay hearing aid test drive patients. If there's a way that you're kind of competing with a TPA, but you're not actually going through that channel, then yeah, I think a test drive or some kind of abbreviated test drive is very suitable for that situation.
Okay, great. Another question kind of on the process here. What is the average time frame that you use for a test drive? And then kind of related, what sort of average time frame do you see typically result in a purchase at the end?
Usually like 2 to 4 weeks for the entire process. 90 minutes for that first appointment to do everything and fit the hearing aids. Follow-up appointments we usually allocate like 45 minutes for. But yeah, 2 to 4 weeks is average. Occasionally like you'll get people who you're really having to try a bunch of options if it's a difficult fit. So it might go longer than that. But when that happens, we're comfortable with that. That's not really the norm, but it does happen occasionally.
Great. Okay, another one here. How do you choose who you present the hearing aid test drive to versus a more traditional, like one appointment sale type process?
I would say everybody. Would you agree,
Yeah.
Adam? Everybody who's not a third-party patient.
Basically, yes.
Okay, and I'll ask a follow-up. Is that true even for existing patients who are upgrading?
Yep.
Absolutely.
It is. The only difference with an upgrade, a lot of times we'll have rather focused marketing, like a database letter about a specific product since they're already your patient. So in that case, you're typically going to fit that product, and if people are happy with it, then you'll wrap it up but they do get a test drive. But the process will likely be shorter. But even with that one, if that device for whatever reason doesn't work for them, then you want to make sure you continue that test drive with other options.
Okay, great. Here's a question. I don't know that we have the data that this person's looking for, but she says, anecdotally, we know that patient success is dependent on good follow-up. But do we have data that we can access to show patients how important that follow-up is. I mean, I know we do that like subjectively. I don't know that we do anything with data. Do you guys have any input on that?
Yeah, no, nothing real specific in terms of the data on that. Not to say that we couldn't. We have appointment data from quite a few clinics to see kind of what happens post, finalizing of the hearing aid test drive, like all the different problems, service, clean and checks and things, annual hearing tests, that kind of stuff that takes place. But I think the key message is that when somebody does go through the hearing aid test drive, whatever their ongoing needs are, that the practice has their back completely and that they're covered. And that's it. That's a good message to relay at the outset, and something that they will learn over time as they interact with your practice and your team.
Okay, great. Here's a question. When do you run real ear measurements, and what if patients need a custom shell to fit their particular loss or they have dexterity issues? How do you handle that?
That's a good question. We typically do not run real ear at that first appointment. Occasionally, some of our providers will, but we're going to reserve that for fine tuning later on, simply because we usually don't have time, and we just want to kind of focus more on just interacting with the patient, getting the hearing aids fit, and answering other questions. As far as custom shells and things like that, we actually have a system and a way of creating custom ear molds on the spot, which we can definitely send you information on. We have a video about it. So we do that right in the office when it's required, which is another thing that I guarantee you your competition isn't doing that. So actually creating custom molds on the spot.
Okay, great. Great question here. What would you say is the average number of demos to have, regardless of brand, that you'll need to have on hand for the test drive process?
Well, I would say that would depend a lot on the volume of patients you're seeing, but it's probably a bigger number than you'd think. So yeah, I don't have a specific number, but for every full-time provider in your clinic, I'm going to say it'd probably be good to have 20 to 30 demos, kind of at a minimum, something like that. Is that what you have?
Units or sets? Well,
units, I was thinking. So that would
okay.
be 10 to 15 patients at any given time might be out in a trial of sorts, in a hearing aid test drive kind of way. So something like that, probably.
I know Adam kind of touched on this during the presentation, but somebody says, what if the patient persists with pricing questions? How do you handle that? I know, Adam,
Sure.
You mentioned giving a range. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say there.
Yeah. So generally speaking, you're trying to reserve the very specific price quote for later on when you have more information. If somebody absolutely needs to know all of the details, then that's what you're going to give them right up front, as far as you know them. So for example, you might get a patient who basically says, I'm on a fixed income, I can only spend $2,500 for a pair of hearing aids. Okay, well, if you know that information and you know it to be kind of a very firm, a hard stop, then I would fit them with a demo that, is going to be within the price range that they're comfortable with. So, you're kind of just being you're being smart about it, rather than just having a blanket answer for everybody who comes in about price. You're kind of strategizing a little bit more, because the fact is, if people haven't tried the hearing aids yet, they don't even know what they need. So that's my take on it.
Okay, great. I have two more questions here, so I'll ask both of them. If anyone has a question they haven't asked yet, go ahead and do that now. So this question is, do you charge for the hearing aid evaluation, or is the evaluation and your time spent all considered free?
Yeah. I'll go ahead. Sorry. So no, we do not charge for the evaluation or any of the items associated with the hearing aid test drive. So we have worked with some practices who do, but I think in a perfect world you don't have a cost, an out-of-pocket cost for any of this stuff, because the idea with the test drive is about making it as easy as possible for someone to get into amplification. So any potential barrier that you can break down, I think is generally a good idea. Although I think we've seen some people that have differed slightly with that opinion and have had success with it. So, I'd say that's where we stand on that.
Okay, great. And I know we're at time here, so I'm just going to ask this one last question. Have you documented a lower return rate in the long term by using the hearing aid test drive?
Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
We process practically 0 returns, and this is across 7 offices that are all very, very busy. So it's pretty incredible. It makes it so awesome. Once you know that somebody is confident and they actually purchase their hearing aid, it's like a done deal.
Right? Fewer returns, always good. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate it. We'll be sending some follow-up emails with the recording and additional information. So if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks again for spending an hour with us today. Everyone have a great rest of your day and a good week. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.